John Davies. Welcome to Digital Markets Research Hub. We know you as an expert in various aspects of European and British competition law and policy. You have long established career in this profession, and we understand that so much is going on in the area of digital markets and beyond. You've been a core lawyer in this field, but now you occupy slightly different aspect, or you deal with slightly different issues, still within the core of competition law, yet slightly different. So without me trying to explain what you do, let me invite you to explain it.
Alice, thank you very much, and thank you for asking me to do this. I'm delighted to do so, and thank you for your generous introduction. So I was a practicing antitrust lawyer through my whole career, something like 40 years, and I ended up being a partner in a major international firm, which I founded the Brussels office. That firm is Freshfields, I think many people know, and I ended up being the co-head of the international group. And then a few years later, when the time came to think about the future, I wasn't ready to prune roses or improve my golf swing like some people like to do, and I wanted to do something else. I had been working with some of the communications and public affairs consultancies in larger high-profile transactions, and we just got chatting. I looked at the market and I ended up where I am now, and I've been here now for nearly 7 years, Brunswick. And so what we do is we work alongside the lawyers who are handling the transaction, lawyers and economists, of course, I should say. And we help to provide advice, strategic communications related to the regulatory processes alongside the lawyers, sometimes within the company, the CEO or the global head of comms or the global head of government affairs wants to have some views to make sure that they are getting a complete picture of the risks in the process, and that's where we come in. We're absolutely not giving legal advice, nor second-guessing legal advice. We're providing a complementary advice. And of course, over the period of time that I've been doing this, antitrust has become obviously more political. And I'm not just talking about the EU. There have been issues in the UK, and of course now there is a whole debate happening in the US because of the advent of what's described in some circles as MAGA lobbying to achieve outcomes that perhaps otherwise wouldn't be achieved. So I think these days anybody's going into a sort of bet the ranch type of deal, a high-profile deal, particularly where they know there are going to be opponents, whether they be political or commercial or both. They need to be thinking through these other aspects. And whilst there are many able lawyers who do understand these things well, not everybody does, and not everybody, even if they have a good sense, has the time to cover the waterfront of potential issues. And so we can provide, we believe, a useful complementary service alongside and make sure that there is a holistic approach and analysis being done to getting the best outcome.
And we understand that the major focus of your professional expertise is played on merger control, but let me ask you, because you can be seen as a kind of barometer, you understand what's going on, you sense how clients feel and what is a regulatory kind of not necessarily agenda, but again how much enthusiasm they have and ambition. Do you think that the latest regulations in digital markets, both in the EU and the DMA and DMCCA, do you think that big companies, though particularly those who are being affected by them, being regulatees in these jurisdictions, do they see it as a big challenge or rather incremental regulatory compliance burden which you can sort relatively easy? Are they afraid? Does the DMA have teeth and DMCCA?
Yeah, personally, I think that it creates a very different working environment for those companies that are, for example, designated as gatekeepers. And it's really important that they recognize that taking what might be a kind of the historical legal approach is not really going to get them to the best place. They've got to have a working relationship with their regulators in the way, frankly, that banks learned to accept the day-to-day regulation of the financial regulators and work a way to manage that. I think then the companies have to identify, what are the most important things that they need to be successful on in regulatory terms. They can't win all those battles, and of course, there may be at any one time, 6, 10, 15 different issues that one of the major digital companies has to face, where the regulators are not happy about what they're doing, and some of those things, frankly, will be spurious because they'll be pushed by complainants, and never the agencies have to look at them. So they have to decide what is the most important. What are the most important things to be successful on, and not fight all the battles. Because fighting all the battles uses up huge resources, both in terms of technical resource and financial resource, and it creates a really difficult day-to-day environment with the regulators. They have to find a way to accept, which is something that I think there are some that are doing it, others not, where they come to realize that and effectively their engagement with the agencies makes the agencies a decision maker in the commercial process, right? It's pretty shocking perhaps for some people to hear that, but I think it's the truth. And the quicker that they find a way to accept that and make it work, the better. And they also have to recognize that they may have a very large house, but it's got a lot of glass in it, and people are throwing bricks all the time, right? It's a bit like having a bunch of teenagers who are kind of wanting to throw bricks at your glass house at the bottom of the garden. It's going to happen a lot, and you've just got to accept it, work your way through it. And I'm not sure, if I may just add one final point, it's not obvious to me that gaining the assistance of your government, if, for example, we're talking about companies that are often kind of American companies, it's not obvious to me that gaining the assistance of the current administration is helpful to your cause, because there's a lot of political weight in the EU, particularly, obviously, but not exclusively, from the Parliament, and the Parliament is watching the Commission like a hawk. And so, I think trying to prioritize the things that are really important to you, let the things go that are not so important, and secondly, make sure that you develop a good working relationship, and then perhaps thirdly, think about the impact of the politics.
This leads me perfectly to the question about strategy of competition authorities, because from what you have described, the reality is that they are ready, the gatekeepers are ready to, they cannot win all the battles, and then they don't have resources. Obviously, we think that stereotypically that the more resources they spend, the more justice is delivered to the world. But this is not the case. There are many kind of shortcomings which are associated with even with end users once will start spending their resources on fighting so many battles. So it's a process where you can strike delicate deals between different stakeholders, and competition agencies, CMA and the Commission even more so, are political entities, or somehow they found themselves being political entities these days because they can influence the evolution of such important area of society, perhaps. So my question is, should I, as a potential hypothetical competition enforcer, continue being driven by this idea that my task, my mission, my mandate is discovering and then protecting this absolute economic truth about competition, which is difficult to measure, but it is measurable? Or rather, I should think more kind of cynically, more as a political entity, and try to, while simultaneously dealing with hard 50-50 cases, I have to bear some broader strategic agenda in mind and adjudicate or deliver my decisions as regulator in a way which would simultaneously contribute to the greater good of my society, of my polity. And if the latter, who should inform me? Where should I get this knowledge?
It's a really interesting question, and um, I think there are some difficult decisions at the margin in cases. I'll come to that if I may. So personally, I think that um, once the politics has led to the adoption of a new regulation, a new law, and that's what's happened in the EU, it's happened in the UK, it's on the way in Brazil, all slightly different versions of the same broad ambition, then the politics should be left out of it. Now that's easy to say and hard to do. And of course, those who are on the receiving end of investigations will always believe that they are a political target, particularly, I was indicating, particularly if they're American companies operating in Europe. But the key thing is, they would expect a European company to observe relevant US federal, or for that matter, state law. And this would apply across all industrial sectors. And they wouldn't even think, oh, of course you've got to obey the law. I mean, that's that's the law's there and you must obey it. So they seem to think, perhaps, in terms of some of the commentary that's been made, that that because the law was being driven by not only member states but parliamentarians, therefore it's political. Once it's the law, it's the law, and so then moving on to the decision making within that, which is what you were asking about. Look, I think it's I think the agencies themselves need to be fact driven, and they need to do a thorough investigation. They need to listen to all sides of the argument. That the companies that are going to be the gatekeepers that are going to be investigated, or equivalent in other jurisdictions, they have very, very substantial resources to defend themselves, and they will deploy them, and they should do, and they're entitled to, and they shouldn't be worried about that. If it comes to a decision about whether or not the agency feels they have the evidence to pursue a case, then they should do what all prosecutorial organizations do. They exercise their discretion. They have to say to themselves, how important is this? How successful are we likely to be? Is it important enough that there should be, this should be decided by the court. So we take a decision, and then we expect to have it appealed, etc. Those are normal, what I regard, discretionary decisions of any prosecutorial organization. But what they can't do is make those decisions based on political aspects. So, they can't say, oh, there is, I'm making this up as I go along, but there is a budding, potentially successful European company in this space. It has filed a complaint against Gatekeeper X. We really want to see this area to grow in Europe. But the problem is we're not entirely convinced about the facts. No, you can't then pursue the case on broader political grounds to kind of pursue European economic agendas. And actually, at least I broadly think that is what has happened and what should happen. Others you might interview might disagree, but it's really very important that that once the law is adopted and it's on the statute book, that the politics is removed as far as humanly possible from the enforcement.
Okay, well then another incarnation, we know that designated gatekeepers are simultaneously being under continuous, they carry the continuous burden of compliance, and that they develop new compliance culture, but simultaneously they compete with each other, and those core platform services which are not designated, which they are not designated within, and their main competitors appear to be most lucrative market, or it's a nice opportunity for them to step in and to accelerate their or increase their presence in that market, and vice versa. So we see this kind of, they are happy to outsource their expertise to DMA team or DMU for this matter. Do you observe this trend? How this process, is it a normal process? It's probably a normal process. It's as long as it's so. Your reflections upon this.
Look, so let me go back a bit in time. Throughout my career, I would say that it was always the case that in a market where there were a small group of leading players, the leading players would look to be using the regulatory regime as a tool of commercial expansion and success. I mean, the most obvious example is, let's say there's I'm picking an end, the personal care market, where there might be kind of 4 or 5 big players. Number 2 and 3 want to come together, and number 4 works out that there's a big sensitivity potentially with a key brand which has substantial market shares kind of globally. If they can, as the price for getting the deal merged, if they can persuade the regulators that is an issue, they then become a potential remedy taker. They can buy that product, and they can then step up in a market within the broader market that they were weak in. That kind of stuff happened all the time. And indeed, the most astute major corporations, have their strategy departments looking at those opportunities to make sure that they maximized those chances. And there were a couple of times when I was instructed by people who were extremely keen to be the remedy taker, and these people tended to be kind of new entrants, but their interest seemed to be focused on telling the agency, whether it be the CMA or the EU or FTC or whatever, how good they were and how they would be successful as the new owner of these assets. And I was trying to say, well, look, before we get there, we we have to prove that there is a big problem in toilet rolls or whatever it was, right? But so back, people have always used regulatory processes as a tool for commercial expansion, and I believe that you've seen it very often. You've had complaints from the US agencies, sometimes from the White House, about European intervention, regarded as inappropriate intervention. But actually, US companies have been very, very active over the years in filing complaints. And I'm not just talking about mergers, I'm talking about, behavioral cases as well, against their domestic competitors, but using the regulatory system that's available in Europe systems to that end. So they're not shy in doing it. And then fast forwarding to to the DMA, of course, you've got essentially US companies being the gatekeepers, or having no doubt that the relevant market positions for intervention by other agencies. Maybe there's a preponderance of European competitors, but there will also be US competitors, to take your point, recognizing that they're weak in an area and they have an opportunity to undermine the strength of a competitor. They will do that, and it's to be expected. And personally, I have no difficulty with that, because at the end of the day, as long as the agency, the regulator, I know that they don't like being called regulators, they prefer agencies, has the resources to investigate properly and make a good judgment, they're the ones who make the decision. They're the ones who say, actually, there's not a problem here, or no, there is a problem here, we need to look into it. And that's kind of what we want. They are the referee of those commercial disputes.
And maybe even more so in the kind of where there is a continuous compliance, where they hear continuously from the same stakeholders, so they can map out the entire digital landscape rather than just ad hoc, who came first and was most eloquent in their message. So
For sure, going back to an earlier point, it's absolutely crucial that the gatekeepers or equivalent, they have a relationship with the people who are going to be living and breathing what they're doing kind of 24/7, and that they can let's put it this way, they can agree to disagree, but without throwing their books out the window, or hurling a laptop across the room. That has to happen, because putting it simply, they're on the receiving end on Tuesday of an investigation, etc. They may be back in again the following Tuesday complaining about something else, and they have to maintain their credibility and they have to maintain their sang-froid. And if it becomes too legal, then it's really hard. And lawyers, and obviously I was one for nearly always, they find it really difficult when the agency is not listening to what they're saying. And maybe it's because the agency, has got deaf ears, but it's quite often because the agency is being told the opposite by somebody else who was in the very meeting room that they are in the day before, and so they're skeptical. But lawyers have a habit of believing, that there is a perfect truth, the right answer should be, and it's a more complex picture than that. So I think if the relationship is too legal in style, then it becomes very difficult to manage your way through what is, I mean, think about it in a family context. If every time you visit your parents, you have a blazing row with your father, it's not good because you still have to be in the family, right? They've got to find ways of doing that.
Indeed. And I wanted to ask you, knowing your expertise not only in this area but also in merger control, and given how much is going on, I wanted to move this conversation to mergers. But the last question on this one: so if the relationships are so delicate and billions are at stake, and business models which govern the world are at stake, I imagine that that these big companies, they obviously entrust their representation to the most eloquent, most competent people. Indeed, we see it in these discussions, how elegant the idea and how refined the messages are. But they also search for trustworthy people who know the regulatory landscape from inside, who live and breathe and understand the mechanics. So competition a bit among, I would call them consultancies, but among the narrative setters, let's say, how big it is, how is it like once you signed once you represent company A in these big games, you have some loyalty, some agency relationship continuously. How volatile this market is? Can you simultaneously different arms of the same company represent different players pretty much in antagonistic relationship?
Okay, but looking at it from the point of view of the companies to begin with, if I was drawing up a blueprint, I would say, look, you need two teams of legal advisors, the best that you can find, the ones that suit you the most, because you need to change horses sometimes. Like I said, if on one Tuesday you're on the receiving end, the next Tuesday you may want someone else to be presenting the proposition. So you need at least two people. And the same may go for kind of other advisors, economists, or people like ourselves, depending on the circumstances. Incidentally, we very, very rarely find ourselves actually in front of the agency itself. We're advising in preparation for and so forth. But lawyers, I think the blueprint would say you need at least two people. Sometimes, even if the lawyer has a regular relationship, they can still have conflicts which pop up for different reasons. So from the point of view of you need the resources, because you've got so much ground to cover, and then from the point of view of the lawyer, usually what happens in relation to a major FANG company is that the lawyer will build a relationship over time, which means that they pretty damn quickly actually will not be taking instructions from certainly from anybody who's complaining against that company, but from others whose commercial interests are not aligned, and that is quite normal. Sometimes you find that lawyers, firms, they can have different people acting for different companies, but they need to tread very carefully. They need to be very sophisticated in their decision making around commercial conflicts, and they need to be very transparent with their clients, because sometimes a company would say, I'll give you, for 7 years, I worked, actually for longer, but I had a 7-year battle within the period of time that I acted for PepsiCo against Coca-Cola, bringing a series of complaints alleging Coca-Cola's abuse of dominance across the EU, and we ended up with a settlement. That there is no way at all that my firm could have done anything for Coca-Cola during that period. Quite regularly, people say, "I got this great opportunity," and sometimes people would be a bit concerned because they wanted to take it forward, and you'd have a sensible debate. I would say, "Well, look, please ask your, are they happy about it's because of the role that we play?" And the answer was always no, because it wasn't that because Coca-Cola would not have engaged my firm when I was at PepsiCo, and there are a few kind of head-on conflicts of that nature which exist in industries where you can only act for one, you can't act for the other. However, in the digital sector, it's a bit more nuanced, and law firms can sometimes act for one or two, but there are historical situations where that's not possible, and people get to know that. So you'll find, that usually there are one or two firms that have that do everything that needs to be done for Facebook, for Meta, I should say, and there are other firms that do everything for Microsoft, and rarely do they overlap. But these things develop kind of over time, and then occasionally there's a falling out. When there's a falling out, now that's interesting, because the client's fallen out with the lawyer, because then they have to work out what their new representation is going to be, and there is this by then very often there's so much institutional memory about why certain things are like they are and why things were done in a certain way. It's quite hard for a company to kind of rebuild all that.
And maybe another dimension of this question, it's almost kind of stereotypical textbook example, Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, they face so many conflicts, and simultaneously, I imagine they have many partnership collaborations as an industry, or so they must protect their industry and promote the industry. So it's a typical frenemy relationship. In big tech, it's probably even more so, where companies simultaneously pay billions to each other to be, let's say, default in their operating system, and simultaneously fight each other. How as a kind of sociological aspect of this issue, is it almost kind of I don't know, schizophrenical, or it's absolutely normal that you somehow switch gears and switch kind of horses, as you said, or what? Is it a normality for big business with big stakes?
Yeah, I think it's broadly a normality, but working out what the solution should be in an individual situation is totally dependent on the relevant sensitivity of the issue, and so that there are certainly cases where digital companies will collaborate with each other, and there are other areas where they will simply not, and those areas quite often give rise, any collaboration might give rise to a competition issue anyway, right? So they're very sensitive about compliance. There's no one size fits all. I've been in situations where this is way back, where I assumed that company A would not have permitted me or my firm to work for company B, when company B approached, and we would talk to company A, and they would say, "Oh, actually, you can do this type of thing, but you can't do that." And so you could find a way, and you thought the answer was going to be 100% no, but actually it was more flexible. So part of the flexibility arises because in a long term kind of well-established relationship, a client doesn't want to upset their counsel too much either. So there's no one size fits all, and you have to kind of navigate your way through it. But you have to be hyper sensitive, and hyper transparent.
Indeed, I think this is a very, very important moment. I hope we'll at some point we'll continue discussing these issues because it's so many questions which I wanted to go further, but it's already a lot for us to digest. Thank you very much, John, for reflecting upon these things. Let us move now to more kind of mainstream issues which occupy the agenda of competition law and policy discussions, namely you draft merger guidelines. Can you reflect maybe through the prism of the importance of merger control more generally? So, because in your words, it sounds very convincing and clear and intuitive.
So I think the new merger guidelines are a very important change. I think that the analysis of what they really mean in practice will take some time to work through the system. People have obviously picked up on the positive side of the more liberal side of the guidelines in terms of allowing parties, the so-called theory of benefit, to justify efficiencies to permit transactions to go forward. And the scoping of the front end of the guidelines addresses what was in the conceptually in the Draghi report, addresses what von der Leyen wrote to Ribera when she took up her post. But it's clearly the case that the Commission has also sharpened up its toolkit in some areas. That, for example, what it said about the theory of entrenchment for dominant companies, which is an extension of the kind of ecosystem concept. That in being in the guidelines, whereas there was a big debate, and in fact there will be an appeal on the whole concept of ecosystem enforcement, I think is sharpens the risk for digital companies for sure. Okay, so the guidelines, whilst they're being discussed in the, I'm going to put it this way, the general economic press as being positive, and telecoms companies, are hopeful and they want more. There are actually some things in there which are going to make it easier for DG Comp to hang their hat on in not permitting mergers. That said, what's the immediate impact of the document? Well, the immediate impact is that companies are focusing, much more on the arguments around the need for scale, the benefits that the transaction will give rise to in terms of resilience. Obviously, the sustainability aspects, because that is something that that Vice President Ribera is very interested in. This is not merger control, but I was involved in the ADNOC Covestro FSR case, and one of the remedies there is about making sustainability technology more available within the EU to certain types of competition. Frankly, not something that I think anybody, even a wise academic like you, would have predicted was an outcome of a likely outcome of an FSR investigation. But anyway, so parties are very much looking at this now. And of course, I should have mentioned, there are cases that are now coming forward where clearly part of the proposition is going to be, we're creating a European champion. And the debate as to when those cases will be approved or not approved, that's live. And so, if I could put it this way, the political dimension political and economic dimensions are being grafted very much onto the justifications, the classical justifications for merger control in terms of competitive analysis. And it will take some time to work through the system. And there are a number of cases happening right now. There's UPM coming out, which is a paper merger. There is the Airbus Leonardo Thales satellite system merger, where clearly the proposition is we need to come together to be able to compete with Elon Musk's Earth link. But of course, there is a smaller satellite competitor in Germany who's already raised the flag of complaint and say, no, this is not good. There is more recently the announcement of the Kona TKL elevator merger, which would create the world's largest elevator company. These are all cases that in the course of the next 12 months will show whether the merger guidelines have changed the merger analysis that we've all been used to since 1989, or not.
But it looks to me that when Europe, let's say Europe in a broader sense, including UK, thinks about industrial policies through the mechanism, through using the merger control mechanism as one of the tools, the diversified tool in its diversified toolbox, it's better not to talk about industrial policy too loud, because the same mergers will have to be eventually cleared in other jurisdictions, and they would probably feel more skeptical about such mergers cleared under this agenda of industrial policy, or it's too sophisticated, too esoteric.
No. I think you're absolutely right, and there are going to be cases where the advocacy narrative in the EU is going to run the risk of irritation in other jurisdictions. I have an expression which makes my colleagues laugh a bit. I call it the waterbed effect, by which I mean, when you're sitting on a waterbed and you push down at one end, you push the water up at the other end, so that there's a risk when you're trying to solve a problem in the EU, you create a problem anywhere else. The problem with my metaphor is that you need to be of a certain age to know what a waterbed is. So younger people kind of wonder what it is I'm referring to. But I think the point is still relevant, that you have to have a kind of global narrative. You can't, for example, taking it away from the EU arena, if you're two US semiconductor companies and you're merging, and SAMR in China is concerned about certain things, let's say supply of sophisticated chips to Chinese companies, and you agree a solution, you might well run into a problem because the White House doesn't like that solution. So you have to have a complete narrative as far as you possibly can, and the kind of the regulatory arbitrage, if you like, following what the guidelines might bring about in the EU is yet to happen, for sure. So it's a phenomenon that people need to be thinking quite hard about.
And thus it makes me maybe to hypothesize that people who've been talking about sustainability and privacy, and they are often being accused for being too idealistic or naive, that the world is burning and we are running behind the two leading superpowers who don't care much about the things, and we just keep talking about privacy and sustainability. So this narrative is not maybe only not naive, but rather most pragmatic one, because it's a universal way to somehow to encourage European companies who are probably more sustainable and more privacy mindful, and thus it can be used as a kind of as a universal shield again, justifying pro-European industrial policy and mergers and beyond.
Yeah, listen, I think a, a lot of people outside of the antitrust world have talked about adjusting merger control to promote economic growth, promote other aspects of European policy, but to my mind, it's been missing the point, which is that merger control is there not to promote economic policy, but it's there to stop a very small number of transactions which will harm competition and may underline economic policy. It's essentially a permissive act. If you look at the statistics, as you well know, we're talking about kind of no more than 8 and 10% going into phase two, and a tiny percentage actually being blocked. So that's kind of misunderstood because people, the headline cases like Siemens Alstom, that was famously blocked. They were arguing, obviously, the Chinese competition was eating their lunch. The commissioner subsequently said no, and the Chinese competition is still not eating their lunch. So it's fact based, but those types of cases are few and far between. And so frankly, the European Union, the portions of the Draghi report, which were over 800 pages, that dealt with competition were very small. Kind of proves the point that actually Europe's problems are much bigger in terms of what needs to be done to promote economic growth.
Indeed, hard to disagree. My last two questions are about an invitation to offer some recommendation. You know the profession from the inside, and you communicate and you see within your firm and beyond what's going on, how the markets are changing. So what do you recommend to those young professionals who try to establish their place in this rapidly evolving field? Maybe you see some features which are missing, or maybe some don'ts which many still do these days, which you would discourage them from doing or caution them from doing.
Well, something I would say initially, which is it's been said by other people before, but I think it's important. If you want to pursue a career in the kind of antitrust and regulation area, it's very important that from an early age that you are very comfortable with the economics. So you have to find a way as you amass your legal qualifications, to learn enough economics so that you understand markets. What is a two-sided market? You understand the basic economic tests that are used, so that from a very early age, you combine those two skills. The other thing I think is that being an antitrust lawyer requires you to present cases, if not in court, at least it's what I call administrative advocacy. You've got to go into a room with maybe 5, maybe 15 members of the agency, and with your team, and you've got to present the case. You may not be standing up, you may not be wearing a wig, but you've got to present your case, and you've got to learn how to be a good advocate. And that's advocacy with a small a, because there are kind of no rules of evidence other than the facts that you present and telling the truth. But I think that is an important skill to learn early on. And there is a kind of there is a side benefit of being a good advocate, which is that when you're having to explain to your client what needs to be done and what the implications are and what the risks are going forward, and how do you deal with that risk when it happens? Again, that is all about presentation, and your advocacy skills will help you enormously be regarded as credible by your client. Just one example, if you have a merger and the client's not interested in any kind of remedy, somehow you've got to find a way to explain to them that that may well happen, and if they're not prepared to kind of front load it and prepare for it, then you've got to, and even if they are kind of say, I don't want to talk about it, I want to talk about it, if and when that happens, because basically the agency is saying, well, if we can't find a solution, we have to go to phase 2. If we can't find a solution, we're going to block this. You need your client to know that you did tell them this was likely to happen, but then you can't say, I told you this was going to happen. You have to zip it. So presentational skills in what we do are very important.
And maybe this advice can be extrapolated also for students, but those who are just at the beginning of their career, they are still studying this rapidly evolving field. Maybe in addition to what you have just said for young professionals, is there any special recommendation for students themselves?
I think, so for law students, I would say, consistent with what I've been saying, if you have opportunities to, whether it's moot court or whatever it is, I assume those things still exist these days, to do that type of thing, then you should do it. The more experience you get of standing up in front of an audience, thinking on your feet, so take those opportunities when you can. The other thing I'd say is, if focus on the thing that really gets you interested. So the reason why I end up being, a former antitrust lawyer, now a kind of continuing antitrust professional, is because I was taught. I was at Bristol University. I was taught European competition law. It was just after the UK had joined the EEC, so it was very kind of sexy and interesting at the time. But I really, really enjoyed it. The professor was called Brenda Suffren. She's quite a well-known lady, and I really, really enjoyed it. And although I say it myself, because I enjoyed it, I got my best marks in it. And then I carried on and looked for opportunities to go as a trainee to Brussels. Because so if you find something that really interests you, even though it's not necessarily the most obvious thing, because at the time, definitely, competition law was in we had the Restricted Trade Practices Act in the UK, so competition law was not understood at all, and people were kind of much more interested in commercial or corporate and going into being M&A lawyers. But I got really interested in competition law. I wish I'd understood a bit more of the economics. That's what I'm recommending. People do it. But to do that, focus on that and make that your thing, because ultimately you'll end up being hopefully enthused about it during your career and being successful.
Indeed, and this is probably another opportunity to say to express academic gratitude to Brenda Safran, Alison Jones, and her
Oh yeah,
new editor, Dunn, for publishing this monumental textbook in competition law.
absolutely. Alison as well. I'm afraid I have not written many pieces in my life, but I did write one thing with Alison, and it was a great experience. And to be frank, she did most of the heavy lifting, but I'm very grateful to her for that.
Yes. John Davies, thank you very much for this conversation.
It's been a great pleasure.